Ladies and gentlemen, honorable colleagues, legitimate sovereignty in any country can only be derived from the people of that country, and when those people are allowed to express their will in free, fair, and real elections that are held periodically based on universal suffrage in an equal and confidential manner. In Iran, thank you. In Iran, the Constitution provides for the establishment of a filtering authority named the Guardian Council, which is charged with deciding a candidate's fitness to stand for elections based on his or her loyalty to the government of Iran. The key issue for the Council's determination is the candidate's heartfelt commitment to the absolute authority of the supreme leader, which is no more than a dictatorship. Although the Iranian people have consistently been denied the right to hold a free election during the 31-year rule of the Islamic Republic, their belief in the need to bring about peaceful changes in the country's governing systems has taken them to the voting booths to make use of the little capacity available to this end. At the end of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's first term of presidency, which had been accompanied with increasing economic pressures, widespread violations of civic freedoms, weakening of civil society, and greater international isolation of Iran, the Iranian people went to the voting booths with hope of bringing about change. However, the declaration of Ahmadinejad's victory led most analysts and members of the public to dismiss the elections as fraudulent and label the incident an electoral coup d'etat. The people of Iran protest the fraudulent results by taking to the streets and participating in silent protests, which were carried out in absolute silence without even a single chant, despite the presence of millions of citizens, but they were answered with tear gas and bullets. The Iranian government tried its best to essentially block any possible dissemination of information through the disruption of internet access by reducing bandwidth, widespread filtering of internet sites, release of satellite parasites, disconnection of mobile phones and international calls, banning of all critical newspapers, widespread arrests of journalists and human rights reporters, and the expulsion of many foreign journalists and banning their travel to many Iranian cities. Once the Iranian security organizations believed that they had blocked all available information channels, they began their oppression of protesters. They raped prisoners in detention centers. Several prisoners died from the tortures they had endured in Iran's prisons. They even drove over protesters with their cars. Their bloody suppression has resulted in at least 80 deaths, 17,000 arrests, and thousands seeking refuge abroad over the past 9 months. However, the Iranian people devised creative new ways to inform the world of what is happening to them, and fortunately today, the world is aware of their trampled rights, as well as the Iranian government's complete disregard of the basics of democracy and human rights. I must tell you, the current human rights situation in Iran is even more worrisome than it was 30 years ago, which is difficult to fathom. Yet the Iranian government is working hard to gain membership in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Considering the severity of the systematic violations committed by the Iranian government, we believe that allowing the membership of such a government in the Human Rights Council will, in addition to being offensive, significantly weaken the organization. In order to help you better understand the human rights situation in Iran and clarify our reasons for opposing the Iranian government's membership in the Human Rights Council, I seek your permission to recount the reports that we have been able to compile despite all existing constraints about the incidents occurring over the last year and the past 9 months in particular. We have recorded at least 38,894 instances of human rights violations by the Iranian government, which has been mentioned before is unfortunately only a drop in the ocean of violations committed in Iran. Over the past 11 months, we have witnessed over 4,381 violations of university student rights, 12,489 violations of the rights of political and civil activists, particularly with regards to freedom of speech, 71 attacks on women's rights activists, 18,675 violations of labor rights, 630 issuances of execution orders and enforcements thereof, with regards to which, as you are aware, Iran is the leader in the execution of juvenile offenders, 616 instances of attacks on political prisoners in prisons, and 1,000 instances of citizens being killed by police forces because of negligent use of weapons or excessive violence. 169 instances of arrests or violations of minority rights, and 400 instances of arrests and violations of the rights of religious minorities. The existence and strengthening of unjust laws that discriminate against women, denial of the Holocaust and events of September 11th by the President of Iran, denial of the existence of homosexuals, Iran's support of government-sponsored and international terrorism, existence of laws that allow for the severance of body parts or stoning, and many other issues can also be added to the seemingly endless list of human rights violations that have occurred just over the past 11 months. I'd like to start by briefly setting forth the Iranian government's absolute disregard of all human rights commitments, including the 1998 UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, based on which governments, including the government of Iran, are required to support human rights activists. Based on available information, since the inception of the popular protests, Iranian security organizations have been operating under the direction of the intelligence unit of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Quds unit of which is currently on the terrorist organizations list of many countries across the world. In their collective analysis, these organizations identified the strength of civil society, civil activists, and social organizations that symbolize democracy as the most significant threat facing them in dealing with the peaceful protests of the Iranian people. This is evidenced by the fact that in addition to thousands of arrested citizens, the majority of the arrestees in recent months have been human rights activists, university students, labor activists, journalists, lawyers, women's rights activists, and activists working in other civil arenas. The vast majority of civil organizations in Iran have been seriously harmed and are under pressure to abandon their work, such that this is hardly any active civil organization whose members have not been arrested in the past few months. As a leading human rights organization that has always conducted its operations in an open and transparent manner within the strict framework of domestic and international laws, we have also not been immune from these actions. Since the beginning of April 2009 until February 2010, we have witnessed 22 incidents of arrest or attempted arrest of our membership, which aim to prevent the continuation of our activities. Despite all of the pressures, we have worked hard to uphold the standards governing human rights activities by publicizing our membership and programs, including our legal, educational, and news reporting work. The government has gone so far to convict and imprison a number of our members on charges of membership in a human rights organization. Once the Iranian security apparatus realized that its convictions and sporadic arrests had failed to halt our activities, it undertook an extensive operation from March 2nd to March 3rd for the arrest of 29 members of our organization, the HRAI, as a result of which at least 15 HRAI members were arrested and a number of others were forced to go into hiding. As part of the same operation, security organizations also began to arrest the family members of HRAI officers who are currently outside of Iran, family members whose only crime is being the mother or sister of a human rights activist. Similarly, through a series of threatening phone calls to another group of our members abroad, they have tried to force our organization to abandon its objectives. As an example of the circumstances facing one Iranian human rights organization, the prison sentences, extensive arrests, effective hostage takings, and threats targeting HRAI and its membership to provide the best proof that the Iranian government does not have the slightest tolerance for the activities of human rights defenders. This brief description of dire human rights conditions in Iran and the lack of security for human rights defenders brings us to the third part. Now, what should be done?
Could you effectively now say what could be done now in the future? Just to conclude, 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes, thank you. 61 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration and many of the main human rights treaties continue to suffer from a lack of measures that guarantee their enforcement. The lack of enforcement guarantees for human rights principles is one of the biggest challenges the world faces today. Over the past 31 years, the Iranian government has been condemned on 28 occasions by the United States alone for its violations of human rights. However, although we welcome them, the available evidence shows that these condemnations have not brought about any real improvement in the condition of human rights in Iran. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and numerous other officials of the Iranian government have repeatedly dismissed international resolutions as worthless pieces of paper and have said that these resolutions are meaningless for them and they will not comply with them. In fact, in our opinion, many times these resolutions are harmful. Anytime a universal consensus has arisen regarding the human rights conditions in Iran, the Iranian government has tried to rebut it with a defiant iron fist. A case in point is the regime's reaction to a UN resolution issued on November 23, 2008, condemning the rapidly deteriorating human rights conditions in Iran. Only 72 hours later, the government hung 10 prisoners in a mass execution. Unfortunately, I must say that considering the behavioral pattern of the Iranian government, we too agree with Mr. Ahmadinejad. Unquestionably, unless and until these resolutions are allowed to break their paper prisons and translate into actions through the use of enforcement guarantees, effectively, the Iranian government will not be forced to uphold human rights.
Could you conclude now? Because we won't have time otherwise for the questions.
Okay, well, what should be done? Can you give me 2 more minutes?
Now, could you really conclude now in two words, maybe just give us the essential of your message. Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, what should be done? To conclude what I'm saying, there's an example. 2 international telecommunication companies have provided Iran with advanced spying software, as my colleague was talking of before, and tracking devices that have caused the arrests of thousands of citizens and civil society activists. All this for less than 0.5% of their gross income. There are many other examples that I will refrain from monitoring because of the lack of time. But I hope that my explanations make clear that the reactions and sanctions that we advocate do not in any way impose hardships upon the Iranian people, but rather grant them some protections against a system that has no interest in upholding human rights. I must add that our organization was placed under significant pressure not to attend this conference, and we were overtly told that our families would face significant hardship should we accept this invitation. However, we decided to attend in order to expose the atrocities committed by the Iranian government and to seek the help of the international community and our colleagues in the arena of human rights across the globe in support of the victims of human rights violations. Thank you.
Merci.